Welcome back to my channel. Today, Carter reaches a point where staying silent no longer feels responsible. Tensions have been building across multiple fronts, and from his perspective, too many people are making emotionally charged decisions without fully considering the consequences. He's watched conflicts escalate, loyalties shift, and communication break down in ways that threaten not only relationships but the stability of the company itself. Eventually, he decides someone needs to say what others are avoiding. When Carter finally speaks up, his tone is measured but unmistakably serious. This isn't casual advice or an attempt to smooth things over. It's a warning, clear, direct, and difficult to ignore. He addresses the growing divisions forming between key players, pointing out that unresolved resentment and personal agendas are beginning to influence professional decisions more openly than anyone wants to admit. Carter understands that strong personalities often clash, especially in a company built on legacy, ambition, and emotional history. But what concerns him now is how quickly those clashes are moving from disagreement into destabilization. His warning centers on one major truth: if people continue operating from pride instead of perspective, the fallout could become impossible to contain. The people listening react differently. Some immediately recognize the validity in what he's saying, while others bristle at the implication that they're contributing to the problem. Carter expects that resistance. He knows warnings are uncomfortable because they force people to confront behaviors they would rather justify. Still, he presses on. He explains that every recent conflict has created ripple effects far beyond the individuals directly involved. Decisions made in frustration are impacting teams, relationships, and the overall atmosphere within the company. Trust is becoming fragile. Communication is becoming defensive. And once those patterns take hold deeply enough, repairing them becomes far more difficult than anyone anticipates. Carter's concern isn't dramatic, it's practical. He has seen how quickly unresolved tension can turn into long-term damage. What starts as a disagreement over leadership or creative direction can evolve into fractured alliances, divided loyalties, and lasting resentment. The warning lands hardest with those who already sense the instability but haven't wanted to acknowledge it out loud. Meanwhile, Hope is moving in a very different direction. Instead of trying to calm the atmosphere, she makes a strategic choice to stir things up, particularly when it comes to Brooke. Hope realizes that waiting quietly for situations to resolve themselves has rarely worked in her favor. This time, she decides to shift the conversation intentionally. The opportunity comes during a discussion with Brooke about recent events, especially the growing tension surrounding leadership, decision-making, and family dynamics. Brooke enters the conversation expecting support and understanding from Hope, assuming they are aligned in frustration over Steffi's actions and the broader shifts happening around them. But Hope surprises her. Rather than simply agreeing, Hope begins raising questions that subtly challenge Brooke's assumptions. She points out patterns Brooke may not have fully considered, ways in which emotional loyalties, old rivalries, and instinctive reactions have contributed to the current instability. At first, Brooke is caught off guard. She expects Hope to vent, not analyze. But Hope's approach is deliberate. She isn't trying to attack Brooke. She's trying to provoke reflection. And she succeeds. The conversation becomes more layered as Hope carefully steers it into uncomfortable territory. She asks whether some of the ongoing conflict exists because people keep repeating the same emotional cycles without recognizing them. She wonders aloud whether certain tensions continue not because solutions are impossible but because familiar roles have become too comfortable. Brooke initially resists the implication. She insists that many of the problems they're facing stem from legitimate grievances and difficult personalities, but not repetitive behavior patterns. But Hope doesn't let the topic go. Instead, she keeps nudging. Not aggressively, but persistently. She points out how often family conflicts become tangled with business decisions, making objectivity nearly impossible. She questions whether everyone, including Brooke herself, sometimes reacts based on history rather than present reality. The more Hope speaks, the more Brooke begins to realize there may be truth in what she's hearing. And that realization creates tension. because acknowledging patterns means acknowledging responsibility. Hope notices the shift immediately and pushes a little further. She explains that if they truly want things to improve, someone has to stop reinforcing the same divisions over and over again. Otherwise, every disagreement simply becomes another version of an old battle. Brooke grows quieter as the conversation unfolds. What makes Hope's strategy effective is that she doesn't frame herself as morally superior. She includes herself in the problem. She admits she has also reacted emotionally at times, also fallen into familiar patterns. That honesty prevents the conversation from becoming accusatory and instead makes it reflective. Slowly, Brooke starts opening up in ways she hadn't expected. She admits that part of her frustration comes from feeling powerless in situations where she once felt influential. She acknowledges that watching shifts in leadership and family dynamics has triggered insecurities she hasn't fully confronted. Hope listens carefully. This is exactly the result she was hoping for, not conflict but honesty. By stirring the pot strategically, Hope has managed to move the conversation beyond surface-level complaints into something much more revealing. Brooke is no longer simply defending herself or criticizing others. She's examining her own role in the larger dynamic. That shift matters. Because once people start recognizing patterns in themselves, real change becomes possible. Elsewhere, Carter's warning continues to circulate. Some dismiss it as overly cautious. Others see it as one of the few truly honest assessments anyone has made recently. What becomes increasingly clear is that Carter's concerns are not isolated observations. They connect directly to the emotional tensions Hope and Brooke are now discussing. The company, the family, the relationships, they are all intertwined in ways that make every conflict more complicated than it initially appears. Hope begins to see that more clearly than ever. Her conversation with Brooke leaves her thinking differently about strategy moving forward. Instead of focusing solely on defending herself or challenging Steffi, she starts considering the larger emotional ecosystem surrounding every decision. That awareness gives her an advantage. She realizes that influence doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from changing how people think about the conflict itself. Brooke, meanwhile, continues reflecting after their discussion ends. The conversation unsettled her, but not in a negative way. Hope forced her to examine assumptions she had stopped questioning long ago. And while Brooke doesn't suddenly change all her opinions, she begins seeing certain situations with more nuance. She also starts recognizing that Hope is evolving. This isn't the same Hope who once avoided difficult conversations or softened every position to maintain peace. There's more confidence now, more willingness to challenge ideas directly while still remaining thoughtful. That evolution earns Brooke's respect, even if it occasionally makes her uncomfortable. At the same time, Carter notices subtle shifts in the atmosphere around him. People are becoming more cautious in discussions, more reflective. Not everyone is changing, but enough are starting to recognize the risks he warned about that conversations feel different. There's still tension, still disagreement, still unresolved conflict, but there's also more awareness. And awareness can change outcomes. Hope's decision to stir the pot may have seemed risky at first, but the result proves meaningful. Instead of creating more chaos, she managed to break through emotional defenses and open space for honesty. That honesty doesn't solve everything overnight, but it changes the tone. Brooke begins approaching situations with slightly more self-awareness. Carter's warning continues influencing how people frame decisions, and Hope herself gains confidence from realizing she can shape conversations instead of merely reacting to them. The larger conflicts remain unresolved. Steffi's leadership still faces challenges. Ridge still struggles to balance competing loyalties. Old resentments still simmer beneath the surface. But something important has shifted. The conversations are becoming deeper. People are beginning to question not just what is happening, but why it keeps happening. And once that kind of reflection begins, the entire dynamic starts to change. Carter's warning served as the alarm. Hope's calculated conversation with Brooke became the catalyst. Together they pushed everyone one step closer to confronting truths that had been buried beneath years of emotional habit, family loyalty, and unresolved tension. And the results may end up reshaping far more than anyone expected. The impact of Carter's warning and Hope's conversation with Brooke doesn't fade after a single day. Instead, it lingers beneath every interaction, subtly reshaping the way people approach one another. Nothing dramatic changes overnight, but the emotional atmosphere becomes more self-aware, more cautious, almost as if everyone senses they're standing at the edge of something important. Hope notices it first in Brooke. Normally, Brooke processes tension externally, talking through frustrations, defending her perspective, reacting emotionally in the moment. But after their conversation, there's a noticeable pause before Brooke responds to things. She's thinking more carefully now, weighing her reactions instead of immediately following them. That shift alone tells Hope the conversation mattered. Brooke begins revisiting recent conflicts from a different angle. Moments that once felt completely justified now appear more complicated. She starts recognizing how often old emotional wounds shape present decisions without anyone fully realizing it. Arguments that seem to be about business are often rooted in family history. Professional disagreements become personal almost instantly because unresolved emotions are always sitting beneath the surface. The realization is uncomfortable, but it's also clarifying. For years, Brooke has viewed many conflicts in simple terms. Someone hurt, someone else, someone crossed a line, someone needed defending. Now she's beginning to see how those stories repeat themselves because each person enters every new situation carrying the emotional residue of the last one. Hope sees the effect this reflection is having and carefully continues nudging Brooke toward deeper honesty. Not harshly, not critically, but consistently. She asks thoughtful questions instead of making declarations. She encourages Brooke to consider motives instead of just outcomes. And gradually, Brooke becomes more willing to admit things she once resisted acknowledging. One of those admissions surprises even her. She confesses that part of her frustration with Steffi isn't just about leadership decisions. It's about feeling replaced. Watching younger generations take control has stirred fears she hasn't fully confronted about relevance, influence, and identity. Saying it out loud makes the feeling real. But strangely, it also lessens its power. Hope listens without judgment, understanding how difficult that level of honesty can be. And in that moment, their relationship shifts slightly. The conversation is no longer centered on choosing sides or reinforcing resentment. It becomes about understanding why people react the way they do. That emotional honesty begins creating ripple effects. Brooke starts approaching conversations differently with Ridge as well. Instead of immediately trying to pull him toward her perspective, she becomes more curious about why he hesitates, why he struggles to take definitive sides, why balance matters so much to him even when it frustrates everyone else. Ridge notices the difference immediately. At first, he's cautious, almost suspicious of the calmer tone. Their history has taught him that moments of peace often disappear quickly. But over time, he realizes Brooke genuinely seems more reflective than reactive. That changes how he responds too. Meanwhile, Carter watches these subtle shifts with cautious optimism. He knows tensions haven't disappeared. The underlying issues are still there. Power struggles, family divisions, unresolved resentments. But his warning accomplished something important. It interrupted automatic behavior patterns long enough for people to start seeing them. And once people become aware of a pattern, continuing it becomes a choice rather than instinct. That awareness doesn't solve problems automatically, but it creates possibility. Carter continues reinforcing that perspective in quieter ways. He encourages clearer communication during meetings, asks difficult but necessary questions when decisions seem emotionally driven, and reminds people to separate personal history from professional judgment whenever possible. Some resist him. Others appreciate the steadiness he brings. Either way, his influence grows stronger because he remains one of the few people consistently focused on long-term stability instead of short-term emotional victories. Hope, meanwhile, begins recognizing something important about herself. The success of her conversation with Brooke changes how she sees influence. For a long time, she believed influence required direct confrontation or visible authority. But now she understands that shaping perspective can be just as powerful as winning an argument. That realization changes her strategy moving forward. Instead of reacting emotionally every time conflict emerges, she starts thinking more carefully about what emotional dynamic is driving the conflict in the first place. She listens differently now, paying attention not just to words but to patterns beneath them. And those patterns become increasingly obvious once she starts looking for them. She notices how quickly defensiveness appears whenever certain topics arise, how specific names or past events instantly shift the tone of conversations, how often people assume motives without asking questions. Most importantly, she notices how fear operates beneath much of the tension. Fear of losing control, fear of being dismissed, fear of becoming irrelevant, fear of repeating painful history. Understanding that doesn't excuse bad behavior, but it makes the conflicts easier to navigate strategically. Steffi also begins noticing changes around her. People are communicating more carefully. Discussions feel more deliberate. There's less emotional chaos, but also less automatic agreement. She senses that Hope's growing confidence and Carter's steady influence are gradually shifting the culture around decision-making. At first, Steffi resists that shift internally. She worries that too much reflection could slow momentum or weaken decisiveness. In her experience, leadership often requires acting quickly and firmly, especially during unstable periods. But over time, even she begins recognizing the value in some of these changes. Clarifying decisions earlier prevents misunderstandings later. Addressing emotional undercurrents directly reduces passive-aggressive tension. Encouraging open discussion creates stronger alignment when handled properly. The irony isn't lost on her. Many of the conversations she once viewed as unnecessary are now helping stabilize the environment she fought to control. That realization doesn't completely change Steffi's personality or leadership style, but it refines it. She remains decisive, but she becomes slightly more intentional about how decisions are communicated and how differing perspectives are handled. Hope notices that too. And while neither woman suddenly becomes completely comfortable with the other, there's a growing sense of mutual recognition forming between them. They still challenge each other, still disagree sharply at times, but the interactions are becoming less reactive and more strategic. That evolution matters. Because unresolved tension handled strategically creates growth. Unresolved tension handled emotionally creates destruction. Carter sees signs of both possibilities still existing simultaneously. That's why he doesn't relax completely. He understands that awareness alone isn't enough. Patterns can easily return under pressure, especially when emotions intensify again. Real change requires repetition, people choosing different responses consistently until those responses become natural. And pressure always reveals whether change is real. That pressure arrives sooner than expected. A new disagreement emerges tied to business strategy but quickly pulling emotional loyalties into the conversation. The old patterns threaten to return almost immediately. Defensiveness, assumption, alignment based on history instead of logic. For a moment it feels like everything could slide backward. But then something different happens. Instead of escalating instantly, people pause. Questions get asked before accusations are made. Clarifications happen before conclusions form. The conversation remains tense, but it doesn't spiral. Carter notices it immediately. So does Hope. It's not perfect progress, Voices still rise occasionally, frustration still surfaces, but the emotional momentum shifts faster toward resolution than conflict. That alone feels significant.